And we're joined by Mark Toth, National Security and Foreign Policy Expert. Good evening, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, Anya and Don.
So I guess Israel is doing what it says is going to do. They said they're going to attack Rafah, and they did so. Now, Palestinian president said only U.S. could stop Israel from attacking Rafah. But we also know that really Israel and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not listening to Joe Biden. Where do you think this is going?
Another million-dollar question. At this point, we're really waiting to see what happens in Cairo. Israel all along has been doing these preparatory strikes in Rafah, taking out tunnels, ammunition depots, and the like, command and control centers where they can find them, etc. But right now, in terms of what we may see or may not see sooner than later in Rafah, it depends on the outcome of these so-called ceasefire discussions that are happening right as we speak in Cairo.
Right, and most likely we can see these more precision strikes being conducted in Rafah, as Israel has been warned not to go in there full-fledged, not only by Americans but also by Europeans. So is this fitting for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu right now to try and at least do these limited strikes while it seems like he still has a little bit more time?
Right. Yeah, I would remind viewers that these kinds of decisions are made by Israel's war cabinet. They're not just being made by the Israeli prime minister. So it's their concerted action that's doing this, and they are prepared. I mean, one way or the other, they're determined, as we discussed, last Friday, they're determined to eliminate Hamas as a ruling party entity, if you will, in the Gaza Strip. And so that's what we're seeing. That's what they're pushing for. Whether or not that happens sooner as opposed to later really, again, goes back and circles back to what's happening in Gaza. I don't think Israel in the long term, to go to your point, is going to be stopped from eliminating Hamas. How they go about it, however, still remains to be seen. Rafah very well could be part of that equation.
Mm-hmm. Now, yes, you're right. I mean, Israel is pushing, but on its way, I mean, we understand that Israel wants to get Hamas. That's very understandable for what it did on October 7th. However, on the way, they're killing innocent people. Now, we did talk about it last Friday, but do you think there is a plan to save? I mean, we already know that over 20 people died today, and in that number, we also have little kids. So it's just, is the price has to be so high for them to get Hamas?
Unfortunately, when you have an enemy like Hamas that intentionally fights behind its civilians, you're always going to have that enter into the calculus. There's probably not a target that Israel can strike against Hamas that they don't have to somehow factor in a civilian cost to it. And that's not because Israel is creating that situation. That's because Hamas is intentionally doing so. And so that's the dilemma. I mean, no modern state has ever really had to face this kind of warfare, these kind of heart-rending decisions as to how you defeat an enemy by someone that's intentionally, hiding behind civilians. Even Russia, for all of their evil in Ukraine, isn't hiding behind Ukrainian civilians or Russian civilians, if you will, to fight their fight. Hamas is, and that just is what's making this such a horrible price that's being paid by civilians in Gaza.
Right now, on the humanitarian aid front, of course, we've seen several developments in this area, especially when we look at World Central Kitchen. They're back resuming operations there. We've seen lots of humanitarian aid actually get through. Poland's donating some parachutes for aid drops, as well as money to UNRWA and the World Food Program.
Also a controversial institution, right, UNRWA?
Well, it
indeed,
is, but
indeed.
But nevertheless, the Polish government has decided to contribute money to them. So, I mean, should we expect that the humanitarian situation should at least get a little better, looking at all these organizations and the fact that so much aid has recently got in?
Don, hopefully so. If this ceasefire can take hold. Now, there's some terminology differences. Israel's not willing to call it a ceasefire. And right now, Khalil al-Yahya, who is the deputy chief of Hamas in Gaza, is in Egypt. They're wanting a more permanent ceasefire whereas Israel's only calling it a temporary one. And they're using a terminology called sustained calm. Again, that just goes to Israel's determination that they're not going to allow Hamas to continue in the Gaza Strip long term. But if this, prolonged calm, sustained calm, as they call it, a ceasefire, however you want to term it, whatever nomenclature you want to use, if that can happen, then yes, the immense, the relief that can get into Rafah and other cities across the Gaza Strip can be upped considerably, because you won't be having these military actions take place day in and day out. I do know, before coming on, I saw comments from the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken that he calls Israel's offer generous, that Israel is going the extra mile to try to reach this ceasefire, and that Hamas should take it. Right now, it's in Hamas's court, and we're going to wait to see whether they decide to accept it or not. And one last point on that. Tehran may be the deciding factor, because they're the ones pulling the strings right now when it comes to Hamas.
And we also know that U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Monday called on Hamas to accept an Israeli ceasefire deal. So we'll see if they will listen to that. If they will, give in to that pressure and something finally will break through. Now let's talk about Egypt. Do you think now that situation is intensifying in Rafah, do you think Egypt is going to budge in any way? Is it going to open its borders, or where is this heading? I mean, because they want to help, but on the other hand, they don't really want to help.
I think that's clear.
It's a fantastic question, Anya. Egypt is really probably the long-term solution when it comes to Gaza. To do that, though, they likewise are going to want to see Hamas eliminated. The earliest ties of Hamas go back to Muslim Brotherhood. The current government in Egypt, basically fought the equivalent of a civil war to some extent, not a major one, but still nonetheless, to eliminate the Muslim Brotherhood. And so there's no blood loss there between them. And so that's why Egypt has always been wary of Gaza as the Strip, is because they're concerned about this Muslim Brotherhood boomeranging back on them in Egypt. But I think going forward, if they can convince Hamas that, look, your day of ruling is done, you can be exiled here in Egypt and we'll protect you, that would be a good thing. And then if Egypt can step up and take more of a leadership role and start to decouple the Gaza Strip from Iranian influence. Now, that's a heavy lift. That's not going to go, happen easily. And Iran certainly is just not going to roll over and say, yep, that's fine. There'll be a conflict. But it would be better that Egypt is leading that than Israel, just given all of the differences of opinion and strong, disagreements between Israel and the Palestinian people.
Certainly is interesting situation. Of course, there are a lot of I know there's reluctance on the Egyptians' part, because once the Palestinians effectively, if they leave the Gaza Strip, well, the likelihoods of them returning, as we've seen in the past, is virtually none. I'd like to talk about the hostages for a minute, because it seems to me like Hamas probably doesn't have as many hostages that are still alive that Israel may believe them to have. And it's probably an issue that they want to hide from Israel and not go the distance with all the hostages just yet. I think the latest number is 33 or something to that
Correct.
effect.
That's what they're negotiating.
So is it possible that despite, I think there's over 100 hostages still held, that we're only talking about maybe 33 of them that are still alive?
Don, it's a tricky issue, because it's just not clear. You can't take anything Hamas says at face value. I do think, since we've centered in on this 33 number, a number that Israel has come down to after days of negotiations in Egypt and through different intermediaries elsewhere, I suspect we do have 33 at least alive. Now, Hamas, like a poker player, is probably reserving, and I don't mean to be crass about it. I'm looking at it from their perspective, not ours, in terms of Western value of life. Hamas is probably looking at it. They've got to keep something in reserve to have something to negotiate with going forward. So I'm hopeful that more hostages are alive. I can't tell you how many. We just simply don't know. I do fear, though, that the majority of that 100 or so that remain unaccounted for probably are already dead.
Now, do you believe that Israel leaders may face soon international criminal court? Because there are some information that they may face arrest warrants from that institution. What is your take on that?
Right. Right. I've seen the reports, and I'm not an international lawyer, so I can't really comment as to just how valid those would be. You know, I understand that Israel is not a member of the ICC,
right.
Wouldn't recognize it. It would be very difficult to arrest the leaders. Look, Israel takes great steps to be accountable unto its own laws, which prohibit many of the things being alleged of it. And I think they've proven over time, unlike Hamas, unlike Iran, that they're willing to hold their own people to account in the judicial system. Indeed, that's what this whole crisis was before October 7th in Israel, between one side of the country that believes in its Supreme Court and its independence from the Knesset. We're fighting over with respect to Netanyahu wanting to bring it a little bit more under the control of the Knesset. So, you know, I'm confident that Israel can get there. They're like any other country. You're always going to have bad actors. Poland has it happen to them. The United States does. So it's just a question of relying on it. I don't think if the ICC pursues this at this point, it's worth doing right now because it sends the wrong message to Tehran. And I think it hurts the cause of peace in the long run. It's only going to cause Israel to dig in. And that's not a good thing. Isolating them at this point when you're trying to bring about a ceasefire, when you're trying to get rid of Hamas through peaceful means via Egypt, it's just not the best approach. But again, it's a matter of law, and it may have to, you know, if they've made these conclusions, they may have to follow suit. I'm just not expert enough in that area to comment competently.
Right. Now, obviously, the situation in Gaza, well, it has to be solved. Many people were saying that it could never be solved by military means alone. Israelis have obviously a different opinion on that. But once we reach the end of this, no matter when that may be, what is the next step forward? Do you think Israel needs to return to the table and they need to begin to discuss the two-state solution that's been so elusive over the past?
Yeah, I've always been a proponent in the long run of a two-state solution. It's really the only workable thing. You have two sets of people living in the same area with cultural, religious, and just personal identities tied to that land, that it's not going to be one or the other. So a two-state solution has to happen. My fear, however, is that as long as Iran remains in the picture, and I'm not a neocon, I'm not suggesting that Iran gets attacked and taken out, but until Iran's influence is negated, until they're, you know, decoupled from Hezbollah in Lebanon, decoupled from Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terrorist groups, the Houthis, until that happens, they're always going to view, they being Tehran, Hamas and the Palestinian people, as pawns in their wider war against Israel. And so that, in my mind, are the two things that have to happen. You have to get rid of Hamas, and you have to somehow contain, isolate, and eliminate Iran as the destabilizing force that it is right now in the Middle East.
Well, getting rid of Hamas is going to be very difficult, especially because the leaders are also all over the world, right? They escaped Gaza and they're everywhere. So once this is over, they may regroup. And also some of the Gazans are also have Hamas in their hearts. So
well, and the ideology tends to replicate itself, especially when we see such horrible humanitarian suffering. Well, it tends to pass down to the next generation. Well, Mark Toth, thank you very much for joining us tonight and discussing this issue. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
On your time, pleasure.
Always a pleasure for us.